this video, I will give you a quick overview on how to model something like this in Blender. It looks like something out of Blade Runner, but it's actually based on a real-life space designed by BYO. I will leave a link in the description so you can check all their work. It's a quick video and I hope it's still going to be useful to someone, but if you're looking for something more step-by-step, you can check out this long-form video where I model this speaker going over the entire process. That said, for this project, we know the center light has a 1.5 meter radius, so the idea is to create a circle with that size, align the image to match, and improvise the rest of the sizes based on it. Next, I was going to move the origin point to the center of the circle, so it scales from that point outward, let's say, and normally you right-click, set origin, and move it, in this case, to the 3D cursor. Turns out, with images, it seems that it has to be done manually from the object data properties in a very intuitive way. Now that I moved the origin, it's simple with the Shift S, selection to 3D cursor, scale, and moving on to the curved wall. For the walls, I opted for less geometry and a subdivision modifier, but I guess that using a bevel modifier with many segments and for the corner and a boolean to do the cut would have been a very valid method as well, and maybe even quicker than this. Anyway, if you go the subdivision route, keep in mind that it needs a crease on all the outer edges for it to work, and on the corners like this, a vertex crease as well. Same strategy to build the outer wall, and for the door, it's a loop cut and then just beveling that edge to create a door section and separate it. For the bench section, this is more what not to do. I built this face to get an inset for the parallel line, but it would have been much easier to select the curve section, move the 3D cursor to the selection, set the origin to the 3D cursor, and just scale from that point. But you know why do that when you can overcomplicate it? If you do this with the subdivision and it looks as bad as this, it needs more geometry. So with K I select the knife and add some cuts here and there and some support loop cuts, and it seems to be fixed. If in some places the shading looks strange, like in this secondary wall, try to select everything and Shift N to recalculate the normals. Lots of cases where something looks off in the shading are fixed just recalculating the normals. For the ceiling, I tried to keep it modifier based, but I had some problems with the shading and it didn't work right, so I went the old school way. That's why I simplified the circle by removing half of the edges, used a boolean and applied it, and then to keep it clean I redid some of the geometry so the bevel will work fine. The bevel is done with a modifier to keep it easy to change. Next, for the rail mounted lights, or whatever the name of those, I needed to know where the table is so I can align the light with the table lines. And in another show of brilliance, I used the same technique as before. Yeah, I know. The rail itself, it's just a bit extruded up and with a solidify modifier for the thickness. Then I used a boolean to cut the ceiling, and I also added to the ceiling a solidify so the cut doesn't leave a hole that you can see through it. It only leaves a recessed section, let's say. Then I duplicated that and added some thickness to it for the final thing that we will see. With this, the overall structure is done, so it's time to move to the furniture. Starting with the table, for the board, keeping it editable and modifier based, it has a bevel set to vertices controlling the corners, a solidify for thickness, and another bevel so the edges can catch some light. The table support is just a cylinder, and for the legs, to keep it simple, I only did one of them and use a mirror modifier to copy it on all the sides. It's just some basic modeling and adding a subdivision to make it rounded and a bevel on the end so it's sharper there. And here this shading problem, if Shift N to recalculate normal doesn't work, the next solution is trying adding a weighted normals modifier after the subdivision in the stack, and it will usually also fix it lots of times. For the mirror modifier, make sure that merge is enabled and increase a bit the distance depending on your geometry so everything looks fine. The smaller floor contact points, not sure what to call those, are most likely an useless detail. I'm not sure the bevels are needed because it's not really visible, so yeah. Next, to reuse the table, I moved it all on a collection, parent everything to an empty, and if this thing happens when adding an instance to the collection, select the empty, Shift S to move the 3D cursor to selection, and in this panel go to collections dropdown and set offset from cursor. Now, if you add a collection instance, it will be centered with the empty and easy to control. I duplicated that a few more times and moving on to the chair. This was the most painful part of the project, but I managed to do it at the end. I looked online for the standard chair dimensions to get started, and the best solution was to use a subdivision modifier on a plane with a few locals to control it. Like for the table, it also has a solidify modifier and bevel for the edges. The backrest, I ended up doing one flat rectangle with rounded corners, another plane to get the curve of it, and then I extruded the first one to go through it, and with a boolean I intersected the two of them. So I got this, and then I needed to fix a bit and add more geometry because the subdivision didn't work correctly. So I ended up joining a few of the edges, and here the key is in general to not overdo it so it's easy to edit and it also doesn't modify the overall shape. For the legs and the metal structure, I built the overall shape with edges of a plane and beveled the corners and then converted them to curves so I can add some thickness to it easier than doing it with modifiers. Similar technique for the back structure, and the good thing here is overall you don't need to go full perfection because I mean obviously it depends on the project, but at least in this case, as long as it looks right, even if something is off by 1 degree, it will most likely not be noticeable and not have a problem. Same as with the table, I added all this to a new collection so I can easily copy it around and did it only once if I need to. And I placed it inside the small collection, the small table collection, so it copies itself to all the other tables. For the bigger tables, I will speed it up because it's very basic modeling and it's in essence the same process as with the smaller tables and same thing with the collection instances. So yeah, let's keep it rolling. Now, one of the last models on the list was the ceiling lamps, which are a very simple cylinder-based shape, and it doesn't really need a lot of details because it's a small piece and it's also painted dark, so don't overdo it because it's not going to be noticeable, at least in this render. And now for what makes this all this render come to life, the shader, starting with the gradient. It's a color ramp with a gradient texture set connected to it, and with Ctrl T I added a mapping node so I can turn it to go from the ceiling to the floor. I also set the world strength to 0 so only the lights we have are the ones we can see. The rest of the lights and materials are fairly simple, and especially here since it's a dark scene, it doesn't really make sense to go crazy with the materials, so keep it simple. And even if it was a much lighter scene, maybe it would be enough. So it's always, I think, best to start simple and then see where you need to complicate it. Here for the materials, what actually makes the biggest difference and what makes this come to life is the roughness of the floor and tables. For some finishing touches, I added some separation on the door from the side walls so it's more visible that it's another panel. And I also added another boolean on the top of this on this wall so I can put an emission shader hidden behind so it throws light from the ceiling like the original design has. And one last tip, even though this scene is on the darker side, don't make it like that episode from Game of Thrones where you don't see anything. Don't do that. Play with the lights and also play with exposure so it's not like a very deep dark. That said, if this was useful to you, please leave it a like and subscribe for more. Until next time, thanks for watching. Take care.